And now I want to introduce you to two folks who are part of a great new anthology that I think you'll really enjoy and appreciate at this moment we're in. It's called Who is Government? And it's an anthology led by Michael Lewis. But today we have Sarah Vowell and Casey Sepp, two of the great writers in this. And we're going to have a great conversation with them today. Look forward to it. Let's get going. Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Enemies List podcast. I'm your host, as always, Rick Wilson. I am joined today by Sarah Vowell and Casey Sepp, who are two of the authors of a terrific new anthology called Who is Government? The Untold Story of Public Service. And I read it over the weekend, and Michael Lewis, Casey Sepp, Dave Eggers, John Lanks, Geraldine Brooks, Sarah Vowell, Camus Bell, a whole bunch of folks who have taken a look at government from a different perspective, and they've humanized it a little bit. And I think this book is so important because the moment we're in right now, where Elon Musk and his incel teen super force are going through the government with matches and a flamethrower, burning as much as they can to the ground. And I say this coming into this as a kind of a center-right guy. I say this a lot. I think government needs to be smaller and smarter and better. But I do think we've lost in this country the narrative and the through line of a lot of the tremendously dedicated people who work in these difficult and important and complex jobs that we know nothing about, and who are deeply committed to something that doesn't pay them very well and doesn't get a lot of public respect, but deserves it. So I wanted to welcome Sarah Vowell and Casey Sepp to the show today to talk about this book and to ask them, first off, and I'll start with you, Sarah. You guys are both writers and authors, and as you got into this project, what was it that drew you into this project? And I'll ask for each of you to tell me who you profiled and why that story was so compelling to you.
So our brief from the Washington Post was to just go into the government, find somebody to write about. That was it. And I found this woman. She's from Conrad, Montana, which is in north central Montana, graduate of University of Montana. I'm a Montanan. And she works at the National Archives. And it's her job, it was her job, she just retired, to digitize the National Archives, which has 13 billion records. And she and her core of volunteers, I mean, it's interesting in the context now because we got this job 18 months ago. A lot of what she was doing, and I think what Casey's guy is doing, is they were trying to get the taxpayer the most bang for the buck. And one of the ways she was doing that is she recruited an army of volunteers to help digitize those records. And part of that just comes from, I mean, she said, being a ranch kid from Montana, where she grew up hauling water, canning vegetables, knitting her own hats, you know, like Montana ranch people do. And her whole reason for being was sharing the records of the American people with the American people, because most of them are in DC or Maryland or at, you know, a few of these regional archives, and digitizing makes the whole archives more fair and available to everyone, whether you live in Alaska or Bethesda.
Yes. And this is the kind of government job that is unremarked and unnoticed by most people. They just don't wake up in the morning and think, wow, there's somebody trying to make every piece of government information available to everybody in the country. And it's easy to caricature like, oh, these bureaucrats who are spending so much money on DEI, when it's actually a lot of people like that.
The National Archives, you know, according to some, is underfunded, like most government agencies, by half. And, you know, like one of the ways she tried to get around that was partnering with corporations like Ancestry.com. And some people have a problem with that, but these records just wouldn't have been, you know, made available otherwise.
Right. So Casey, tell us about, your chapter was called The Sentinel. And I found it kind of a little heartbreaking given what's happening right now with veterans in the country. Tell us about the man you profiled.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly become more and more poignant to think about the career of someone. I wrote about a man named Ronald Walters, and he's been with VA for 40 years. And Ron has worked the majority of those years with an agency probably many of us had never heard of, the National Cemetery Administration. And the NCA is this tiny little part of VA, and they bury 140,000 veterans and their family members every year. And they tend to 155 national cemeteries around the country, not just in DC. So right away, the stereotype of the bureaucrat who's in Washington who only serves political interests. Ron and his colleagues, there are about 2,300 of them who manage these cemeteries. They're in almost every state, they're in almost every territory, and they tend to the perpetual memory of 4 million American heroes. And what's incredible about Ron, from the moment you meet him, he's the least political person. And I don't mean that he doesn't have politics, but he has seen his entire career as a service to the VA mission, not to any given administration or political party. And I think when he goes to work every day, he's connected to the deep values of this country, going back to Lincoln and Washington, of who we are and the sacrifices that made us who we are. And it's heartbreaking to see his part of the VA or any part of the VA politicized or reduced to partisanship, because just the NCA alone, 65% of these people are veterans themselves. They are so mission oriented. They did not look for a government job in the sense of, oh, I want to serve the Democratic Party or the Republican
Hmm.
Party or the Libertarian Party. The agenda they want to advance is serving their fellow veterans. And
Sure.
so, Ron, I mean, why I chose him, I come from a military family. My grandfather served in World War II. Two of my uncles were in the Army, one of them lifelong Marine. I grew up in a place where I think, again, kind of anathema to the stereotype, like, I'm a journalist, but I grew up truly like in the spirit of the Alan Jackson song, like, bow your head to Jesus, stand up for Uncle Sam. Like, this is the part of the country I'm from. We are extremely patriotic, and part of that patriotism has always been tied to honoring the troops and supporting our veterans. So I felt called to Ron in a kind of deep calling to deep way. But the other thing I loved about Ron, and this work would be meaningful no matter how well he and his colleagues did it, but they do their work better than anyone in the private sector included. So,
Right.
part of this profile isn't just,
Like
okay,
literally, they're
literally, quantifiably, the
Hmm.
University of Michigan Business School, which goes around every year, like collecting this data on behalf of Chick-fil-A and Costco and Walmart and every corporation that's trying to empty your pockets. They also survey the federal agencies and government agencies. And the NCA, like, you think of most agencies like the IRS or whatever, they get like a 68 on this 100-point scale. Ron and his colleagues have gotten a 97. They have topped this survey for 7 consecutive surveys, again, outpacing every private sector company who spends millions of dollars on advertising and PR. Here's this little part of the VA that just goes around trying to do their job well. So I loved Ron because the work itself is so meaningful. And I think it's part of what makes this country actually great. It's not, of course, we could survive if we didn't repatriate our military dead, and we didn't create shrines and monuments to peace like Arlington or Gettysburg or any of these places we've consecrated. But of course we should, and we can. And not only should we create them, we should tend to them and nourish them and bring our young people into them. And so I loved Ron kind of top to bottom. And I mean, Sarah, you put it beautifully, like what our task was. I keep saying our job was to fall in love with a bureaucrat, and I just fell in love with Ron and the work that he does. So it was really just a gift to write about him. But you're right, Rick. It's a heartbreaking thing to look back on now, because we're dealing with people who politicize Arlington, who attack the VA, who reduce funding even for these incredibly non-political repositories of American life.
well, I mean, one reason I think people are latching on to this project is how rare it is. And part of that is the press's fault, but part of that are these people's fault. Like, I mean, your guy, Ron, my woman, her name was Pamela Wright. They're very modest people. I mean, you talk about Casey going to interview Ron and he just wanting to tell you about all the people he works with and what they're doing. My person made me spend 2 days following her around 2 different National Archives installations talking to literally everyone underneath her in the org chart. And I mean, that is why she's a great leader. And that's why Ron is a great leader, it sounds like. But it's also, they're not so good at blowing their own horn. And one reason we're in this predicament we're in right now is because the federal government has done a not great job at telling the American people what they're up to.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And
Bad at bragging is a really good quality in a person.
Right, but as
not in a government agency.
Right, but as when they're trying to tell a story that could, mean whether or not they remain in existence at all, is I think I think it's one of the reasons that Trump and Musk have been so successful at this arson that's been going on. Because if you did want to cut government appropriately, you'd get people in government to audit things and to help you figure out where you could save money and where you could improve things. Instead of this, just like this madhouse act that's going on right now.
Yeah. I mean, I think in an ideal world, Rick, like you'd be talking to our subjects, not us, but as is the case with so many of these people, they appropriately see their role as, they're paid to do their work, not to blow their own horn.